Right, well, hi there. My name is Darren Naish, and in this talk, I'm going to tell you about the dinosaurs of Crystal Palace. This is the script of a talk titled The Dinosaurs of Crystal Palace, Among the Most Accurate Renditions of Prehistoric Life Ever Made. This is a talk that I actually gave back in September 2018 at the Crystal Palace Dinosaur Days event. Now, if, like I did, you grew up reading books on dinosaurs and other prehistoric animals, the story of the Crystal Palace dinosaurs feels extremely familiar, perhaps even overly familiar. My own introduction to the Crystal Palace models came from the children's book Fanny and the Monsters, and this story is told in numerous popular books on dinosaurs written for younger people. So I was always aware of the models long before I ever actually saw them in person. So my main concern when talking about them is that we tend to hear the same stuff about the Crystal Palace models again and again. And the thing that's stated most frequently is that they're tremendously out of date, that they're really inaccurate, and that they're little more than a monument to the mistakes of the past, and specifically those of the 1850s. What I really want to emphasize in this talk is that this is actually a disingenuous, boring and misguided way of looking at them, and that on the contrary, we really should think of the Crystal Palace prehistoric animal models as being head and shoulders above the vast majority of modern efforts to depict prehistoric life. And in the rest of this talk I aim to justify that opinion. And I should add that my thinking on this issue is not in the least bit novel. It's derived from the writings and thoughts of others who've gone before me, in particular Steve McCarthy and Peter Doyle. Now, at the risk of repeating stuff you have heard a million times before, probably, the Dinosaur Court was constructed during the 1850s when the Crystal Palace was relocated from Hyde Park to Penge in southeast London. The decision was made to create a landscaped garden in the grounds incorporating this so-called Dinosaur Court. And as far as I understand, we're still not exactly sure whose idea this was. It might have been the brainchild of Prince Albert himself. It might have the idea might have come from Joseph Paxton, the designer, gardener and architect who actually designed Crystal Palace. And another possibility is that the idea actually came from Richard Owen. Now, Richard Owen is well known among people interested in fossils. He's well known as Britain's premier Victorian paleontologist. This is the guy who came up with the name Dinosauria in 1842, who described the vast majority of British dinosaur remains discovered during the 1800s, who realised that a small number of very distinctive fossil reptiles possessed an unusual set of features that made them different from other reptiles known at the time. They had reinforced hips, an increased number of hip vertebrae, pillar-like limbs and so on. Owen was also the first to properly interpret the moa of New Zealand. He was the first to describe the various giant fossil mammals brought to England from South America by Charles Darwin. He described the giant Pleistocene Australian animals like Diprotodon and Megalania, and so on and on. But Owen was so much more than this. He was also a leading anatomist and zoologist interested in living animals. He worked on the platypus. He described the anatomy of camels, various marsupials, rhinos, apes, numerous other living species. Now, whether Owen was linked to the genesis of this idea or not, he had a crucial role in that he was the consultant for this project. We don't know all that much about his specific role, but it has to be assumed that his ideas on the animals were crucial. Now, having mentioned someone who was behaving probably as a consultant, we do know that Gideon Mantell was approached and asked to be consultant for the Dinosaur Court in 1852. Mantell, of course, had named and described Iguanodon from East Sussex, one of the three founder members of Dinosauria. Mantell did this in 1825, and Mantell also named the armoured dinosaur Hylaeosaurus, the second of the three founding members of Dinosauria, and he did that in 1833. He very much wanted to be Britain's leading paleontologist, and this was an ambition that led him to become something of an enemy to Richard Owen. But by 1852, Mantell was in very poor health, and consequently he had to decline this invitation, and indeed he died later on in the same year. Interestingly, we know that Mantell had a very different vision of dinosaurs from that of Richard Owen. So Owen argued that dinosaurs were pachydermous animals, that they were really heavily built, that they had short bodies, stocky limbs, and relatively short tails, whereas Mantell regarded these animals as being rather more like gigantic lizards. With Owen at the helm, consultant, who would actually design and construct the models? Well, this job went to Benjamin Waterhouse Hawkins. Now, today, the name Benjamin Waterhouse Hawkins is synonymous with Crystal Palace, but he was chosen because he was essentially the perfect person for the job. Hawkins was an established and prolific illustrator of zoological subjects. He had, for example, illustrated the specimens that Darwin brought back on the Beagle. He'd produced classic works on the anatomy of dogs and deer. He was a world-famous expert on animal anatomy and artistic depiction. So we have one of the world's leading paleontologists and one of the world's leading anatomical artists at the helm of this project. Now, moving on, there are a few things in particular you need to take away from this talk. The first of them is that the Dinosaur Court wasn't just a prehistoric animal theme park where models of creatures were posed randomly in a landscape garden. This was instead a meticulously planned guide to geological and evolutionary history. The arrangement of animals and the very landscape itself was designed to guide visitors through the changing pattern of life over time. So the animals are arranged in geological sequence. They are associated with and sometimes even standing on rocks that represent the very strata from which their fossils were exhumed, and specific exhibitions, a rocky cliff, a cave, a geologic section, a 3D geological topographic map. They were all designed to show visitors where these animals fit within geological history. And you can see from historic photos, like various of those that you're seeing here, that all of this stuff was specially constructed for the display. Visitors weren't expected to just figure this out for themselves. There was a guidebook written by Richard Owen himself. Now, today it's really difficult to appreciate this deep time geological backstory to the park because much of this clever landscaping was modified or even destroyed during the 1960s renovation, which can only be described as an absolute disaster in terms of what it did to the entire park. The park was properly landscaped to be attractive and pleasant. Fountains and water towers were nearby within the grounds. A complex system of piping was in place such that the watercourse around the islands with the prehistoric animals rose and fell. This meaning that various of the creatures at the water's edge would be hidden and then revealed with the changing water level. Let's now move to the animals themselves. Now, we refer to the models here as the Crystal Palace Dinosaurs, but in fact only 4 of them belong to that specific group of dinosaurs. Dinosaurs were brand new and exciting in the early 1850s. They'd only been scientifically recognised in 1842, and at this point only 3 were known. The big predator Megalosaurus and the herbivores Iguanodon and the spiky Hylaeosaurus. Now, perhaps ironically, I don't want to talk about those animals that much today. All I'll say is that Hawkins' models of these animals faithfully portray the animals as reconstructed by Richard Owen. That is, they were all depicted as pachydermal quadrupeds, as proportionally short-tailed giant reptiles that were kind of like reptilian versions of big quadrupedal mammals like rhinos and bears. Moving now away from dinosaurs, let's talk about the marine reptiles portrayed in the Dinosaur Court, and we see models depicting 4 different sorts of marine reptiles. Number 1, long-necked plesiosaurs. Number 2, ichthyosaurs. Number 3, teleosaurs, that's a group of crocodile line archosaurs. And number 4, mosasaurs, a group of giant swimming lizards. And the first 3 of these are depicted together. They're arranged in what was meant to be, they're arranged on what was meant to be an ancient beach and shoreline, and they are all essentially contemporaneous. They're all from the lower Jurassic or Liassic. The Plesiosaurs at Crystal Palace. They represent 3 different species, not all of which are necessarily close relatives. They are depicted in poses that were thought correct at the time. It was thought during the 1850s that plesiosaurs were capable of propping themselves up on their paddles and resting on land. Now, there are various reasons why this is actually unlikely, but it does remain possible that some of the smaller kinds were capable of this sort of behaviour. And it was also thought at the time that these animals mostly behaved in swan-like fashion, keeping the neck and head well above the surface of the water. This was an idea that was first depicted by Henry de la Beche in his famous and much copied Duria Antiquior illustration of the 1830s. And again, we can say today that this is actually very likely incorrect. Plesiosaurs didn't really swim around with their necks held in this pose. But the key thing here is novelty. Plesiosaurs at this point had only been known to science for about 20 years. They were discovered, named and officially recognised following Mary Anning's discoveries of southern Dorset made during the 1820s. And life reconstructions like those of de la Beche had only been around since the mid-1830s. So any depiction of plesiosaur life appearance in the early 1850s has to be, for people of the time, a really novel, exciting thing that'll be new and surprising to the majority of its audience. For comparison, consider today that there are still people who are unfamiliar with depictions of feathered non-bird dinosaurs, and yet here in I gave this talk in 2018, so here in 2018 feathered non-bird dinosaurs have been known to science for more than 20 years, and yet we, in an age of instant digital communication and the internet, we're still talking about this as if it's a new thing. Now, moving now away from plesiosaurs, I want to use one of the teleosaurs, as a heron for scale in this photo, to introduce you to the high degree of anatomical fidelity we see in many of the models. Look at the scalation that Hawkins constructed on this model. You can see belly scales and neck scales differing in size and shape, and seemingly even in texture. The neck scales have a kind of softer look than the belly ones. Hawkins presumably used living crocodilians as a reference for these models, and this is a clear example of his skill and expertise as a restorer of extinct animal life appearance, and we'll come back to that point in just a minute. So there are a couple of ichthyosaurs in the Dinosaur Court. Let's look at this one in particular. This is not the more familiar Ichthyosaurus, but instead it's Temnedontosoros plateodon. That's why it's so big. Ichthyosaurus is mostly 2 to 3 meters long. Temnedontosaurus is a giant, 6 meters long or more. And as you can see from the skulls in the photos here, in one of those photos you've got a person for scale. This is a very sizable animal. Now, it's universally known today that ichthyosaurs like Temnedontosaurus had dorsal fins and a vertical shark-like tail. Temnedontosaurus is actually a fairly archaic ichthyosaur. It's not a member of the tuna-shaped advanced ichthyosaur group called Tunnasauria. It didn't have the shorter tail and taller, larger dorsal fin of that group. At this time, everyone thought that ichthyosaurs were pseudo-crocodilian, probably amphibious, with some kind of expanded paddle-like fluke at the tail tip. It wasn't yet known that advanced ichthyosaurs had a dorsal fin or a vertical shark-like tail. This is a view that emerged just a few years later following discoveries made at Holzmarden in Germany. So the Crystal Palace ichthyosaurs are absolutely in keeping with what was considered correct at the time. And everything I've just said is familiar stuff. It's repeated in most works that discuss our evolving knowledge of ichthyosaur life appearance. What's less appreciated is the detail depicted in the eyes and paddles of the Dinosaur Court models. You very likely already know that ichthyosaurs have a gigantic bony ring. It's formed of interconnected bony plates located within the tissues of the eyeball. This is called the sclerotic ring, and it looks something like a pineapple ring. But notice that it's depicted in the Dinosaur Court ichthyosaurs as if it were visible in life. Incidentally, the sclerotic ring is in no way unique to ichthyosaurs. It's widespread in vertebrate animals, and vertebrates that lack the sclerotic ring, like mammals, are actually unusual. The second thing I want you to note is the ossicle pavement depicted on the upper surface of the forelimb. So we have this pavement-like covering of pebble-like bones fringed along the edges with parallel strips of some kind, which you can see in the paddle of the Crystal Palace ichthyosaur shown in the photo there. What we are seeing here is something that was brand new as of the early 1850s, because in 1851 Richard Owen described this four-paddle, the specimen you can see on the right of the slide. It comes from Barrow upon Soar in Leicestershire, and this specimen was a real surprise to everyone because it showed how the tightly packed polygonal paddle bones were surrounded in life by a series of unusual plate-like structures, which presumably had some role in stiffening the edges of the paddle. Now, when I wrote an article about the Crystal Palace ichthyosaurs back in 2016, my thinking was that Owen and Hawkins had deliberately opted to show these aspects of anatomy, the sclerotic ring and the paddle ossicles and plates, in X-ray. They were deliberately showing them in kind of an accentuated way so that visitors could better understand the underlying details of the anatomy of the bony structure. This seems odd and inconsistent with the look of the other animals in the park, but it seemed right enough. And again, it isn't an idea that was original to me. I think it comes from Steve McCarthy. However, it seems that this was wrong, and that as bizarre as it seems, this is actually how Owen and Hawkins thought ichthyosaurs looked in life. The giant thick sclerotic plates forming the sclerotic ring. Now we know today, thanks to our knowledge of modern animal anatomy, we know that they're embedded within the soft tissues of the eyeball. But they were thought at the time to be externally visible on the outside of the eyeball, with only the transparent cornea covering the ring. The bony ossicles and associated plates on the paddles, they were also thought of as externally visible features, and my thanks to Ben Chrysler for his research on this subject, and is something that we intend to publish on eventually. Finally, on marine reptiles, let's have a look at the Mosasaur. Mosasaurs are giant marine lizards. They're known today from numerous complete skeletons, some of which are preserved with soft tissues, which give us information on skin anatomy, the shapes of their tail, fins and paddles and so on. What makes Mosasaurs especially important is that a partial skull discovered at Maastricht in the Netherlands during the late 1700s was one of the first indications that giant extinct animals, representing species quite different from those of today, existed in the distant geological past. Fast forward to the 1850s, and Hawkins only really had this skull from Maastricht to go on. So his reconstruction is speculative, but it's also really clever because, in contrast to the other marine reptiles, note that much of the model is concealed. Now again, look here at the anatomical nuance, the detail that Hawkins depicted. Look at the scalation around the edges of the jaws, the fact that we see different sorts of scales on the head, shoulder and body. The fact that the animal has been given a paddle-like limb is a speculation, but it's an entirely reasonable one, and it's one that ultimately turned out to be correct. It was verified by fossils found in North America and continental Europe from the 1860s onwards. At various points, this Mosasaur model has been damaged. It's had its lower jaw broken, but it has more recently been repaired, I'm happy to say. Now, there's absolutely tons more that I could say about the look of the remaining animals, more than I have time for. There's lots that could be said. Dicynodonts, which were thought at the time to be turtle-like. There's lots we could say about the temnospondals. You can see one of those models in the lower left there. They were thought at the time to be frog-like. And there's also an enormous amount to say about the pterosaur models, which are especially interesting. So the Paleogene mammals, the Anoplotheres and Paleotheres, they're not that conspicuously different from modern reconstructions that take account of more recent paleontological finds. The giant sloth Megatherium present here on the left. This is shown with a proboscis, and that was thought correct at the time, and today we think that probably isn't correct. The giant deer Megaloceros is shown as looking like a giant red deer stag, and at the time, again, this was thought to be correct, but more recent work, including that by Adrian Lister and colleagues, indicates that Megaloceros was more likely a close cousin of the fallow deer. There are various reasons for thinking that it would have had a rather different look from this. So here's my main point. I want this to be the take-home point that you remember when you think about the prehistoric animals of Crystal Palace. So this fact that you've heard on numerous occasions over the years, that the models are wrong, or inaccurate, or even laughable or hilarious, completely misses the point. Yes, the models are dreadfully inaccurate, as goes our modern understanding. They are wrong. We have discovered tons of information that demonstrates how wrong they are. But seen within the context of when they were made, that is to say the 1850s, they were absolutely cutting edge. They took account of information that was absolutely brand new and would have been astounding and surprising to the audiences of the time. But there's more to it than that. We're talking about an outdoor theme park style project that aimed to educate the public and introduce them to a whole swathe of information that was entirely new. Ultimately, this has to be considered one of the most bold and successful science outreach campaigns of all time, an effort to bring specialised paleontological and geological knowledge to the public at large. Furthermore, it was led by one of the world's leading paleontologists. I'm talking about Richard Owen here, of course, and the creatures themselves were designed by and constructed by one of the world's leading anatomical and natural history artists, Benjamin Waterhouse Hawkins. He was at the top of his game. He was absolutely the best person in the world to be doing this, and he clearly went to great pains to get everything as technically correct as possible. Here's an example of one of many examples of a phenomenal amount of anatomical nuance that he built into these models. Just look at the curves and the impression of bulk and mass on the side of the body of the iguanodon here. Now, in short, if we look at the Dinosaur Court in modern terms, it will be considered a world-class, top-quality, blue-chip visitor experience. Today, we're very proud of our accrued scientific knowledge. We know that we are, of course, well ahead of the Victorians, as goes what we know about prehistoric animals and their life appearance, biology and evolution. But for all our criticism of the Victorian Dinosaur Court, for all our pride in our modern knowledge, we have generally not come close to the Dinosaur Court, as goes accuracy, expertise, technical panache. Modern dinosaurs are pretty poor in comparison. Even when they supposedly involve the input of an expert, they're often crude, the animal models typically being well behind the times, as goes technical accuracy. So for those modern scientists who have said negative things about the prehistoric animals of Crystal Palace, I would say, could you do better? And in virtually all cases, the answer would be no. Indeed, until very recently, it was in fact impossible to point to a modern installation or exhibition that did or does come close to the Dinosaur Court of Crystal Palace in terms of its up-to-dateness and technical accuracy. Prior to 2017, I used the 2010 Summer Science Festival exhibition on pterosaurs, led by Dave Martill and Mark Whitten of the University of Portsmouth, as the best example of this sort of thing. Scrupulously accurate, shockingly odd, novel to its audience, backed by appropriate expertise. Today there's an even better example. It's called Dinosaurs in the Wild. It is now closed, but it was an immersive travelling exhibition on show in Birmingham, Manchester and London. It portrayed late Cretaceous North American life to its audience. It included animals radically new and weird to the vast majority of its audience: fuzzy tyrannosaurs, fully feathered dromaeosaurs, giant asdarchid pterosaurs and so on. I am unashamedly biased because I was the consultant. I am not comparing myself to Richard Owen. There's no way that that's accurate, but it's projects like like this that are most comparable to the Dinosaur Court at Crystal Palace. So the next time you hear someone imply or state that the Crystal Palace animals are inaccurate, you will, I hope, know what to tell them in educational scope, in anatomical and technical details, in the experience of its consultant and creator. It is vastly superior to virtually all modern efforts to portray prehistoric life. And I will end there. I hope you found this interesting, and I hope you think of the Crystal Palace animals in a new way. Thanks very much for listening. Goodbye.